Okay. Hi, my name is Alexander Fred. I am a philosophy major at the University of Dayton. Um, the title of my paper is On the Escapable Meaninglessness of the Being for Itself, a phenomenological examination of Solomon's absurdism and Ecclesiastes following analysis of Camus and Kierkegaard. The essence of this paper is basically to examine the different portrayals of the absurd as presented by Camus and Kierkegaard. Then uh, look at them from the perspective of Ecclesiastes, the book written in the Bible, as a way of showing that there's a synthesis between the two different views. So my paper begins through an examination of Camus' view of the absurd. His view, which is found in the myth of Sisyphus, is basically that there is a divorce between the individual human being and the greater world around. I bring in elements of Sartrean philosophy without trying to confuse the two, and I discuss the essence of the being for itself in this divorce. The being for itself is essentially that human being who is conscious of his own existence, conscious of his death that could come, conscious that he can make anything of himself in the future, that he has a potentially an endless supply of choices for him, and he's always choosing. Unlike the being in itself, which is just a static identity, a tree, a cat, a dog, something that doesn't necessarily know that it's going to die, doesn't necessarily know that it exists as such, and doesn't have the propensity to choose in the way that beings can. So when I discuss the being for itself, I'm discussing in essence the human being using Sartrean language. So the being for itself has the propensity to understand its position in the world, understand that there is likely no objective a priori meaning for existence or reason to be here, that the world is a vast, irrational void without any clarity, that we can hope for nothing, that there is nothing out there for us, or at least nothing that we can know. There is no ability for any epistemological verification of anything for us. It's always a floating question, and our consciousness promotes this. Um, and so we are divorced from the world. We search for meaning. We search for clarity, but it's not there to be found. And this is the essence of philosophical suicide, which is where Camus and Sartre diverge. For Camus, philosophical suicide is that hoping for something beyond, hoping that there is some way to reconcile this absurd divorce, whether through a leap of faith in a religious or spiritual sense, or even a Kierkegaardian sense, or the existential negation, that you must negate your own being, your own existence, in order to find meaning. This is just as philosophically suicide as that religious leap of faith, that there is in essence no way to bridge this divorce. And when we try to negate our existence, our being, in order to redefine our being, we are not being authentic to ourselves. In the language of Sartre, this would be a sort of form of bad faith, which is ironic because Sartre is the one who creates and discusses this. So understanding this position of Camus, we can move into the aspect of Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard, for Camus, commits philosophical suicide through his leap of faith. That there is something out there, an absolute, that we can stand in front of as a particular subject. So for him, there are three phases, or three stages of existence. There's the aesthetic stage, the pursuit of sex, hedonistic pleasures, even food or drink, anything that brings pleasure to the particular self. And there's the ethical sphere, which transcends this, which is its antithesis. It is the crowd. The ethical norms and situations to which we adhere, to which we belong as a group of people. Now, it would mean that to return to the particular would be to return to this form of asceticism, this ascetic belief, this pursuit of hedonism, this pursuit of just particular enjoyment in life. But Kierkegaard tells us that by taking a leap of faith, there is an absolute who transcends the ethical. It is this transcendence, this teleological Um, that's the term he uses. That we are no longer just part of a universal crowd. We stand alone in front of the absolute as a particular, and what we do there can no longer be dictated by universal social norms or ethics. So in Fear and Trembling, we see Abraham, who was told by God to sacrifice his son. For us, this is a form of murder from the perspective of the ethical crowd. To kill your son is to commit murder. But by standing in front of the absolute, in front of God, this is no longer an act of murder. We cannot judge this from the ethical sphere because this religious sphere transcends it. This is the highest stage of existence. And this is the absurd. It is this leap of faith by virtue of the absurd, because we pass the crowd as a particular without returning to the particularity that once defined us in such a way that we are no longer held guilty or innocent by ethical norms. This is absurd. Does not make sense. We cannot rationalize this. It is irrational. So we see this irrational thread in the absurd of Camus. But for Camus, nonetheless, this leap of faith, no matter how absurd Kierkegaard might see it, is philosophically suicidal because it does not adhere to the divorce that Camus sees as empirical, as bound to this world and bound to the human subject within the world. It is a leap beyond that. It is a leap into something else, something we do not know, but an absolute metaphysic that defies the non-metaphysical approach of Camus' philosophy and thought. I look into the text of Ecclesiastes, and I see for myself then the first absurdist text, because I see and hear a synthesis between both the view of Camus and the view of Kierkegaard. Solomon, or the anonymous author, whoever wrote it, tells us everything is meaningless. Food, friendship, sex, procreation, everything is meaningless. And this quote reverberates throughout the entire text and reflects the essence of the Camusian absurd. Everything is meaningless. There's a divorce between man and the world. It cannot be bridged. Nothing can become clear. Nothing has meaning. It is all meaningless. There is nothing for us to find. And we see that he addresses all of the stages of existence that Kierkegaard presents. The aesthetic sphere, the pursuit of hedonistic pleasures, of friendship, meaningless. The ethical sphere, any norms, any sort of camaraderie with friends that we could have in a sort of crowded universal situation, meaningless. Even our duty to God, though it exists, becomes meaningless. And this is where we see Kierkegaard most present. Because Solomon, while proclaiming that there is a duty to God, tells us implicitly, but still tells us, this is just as meaningless as anything else. So we have this duty to God. We are divorced from God. We are divorced from the world. We are divorced from everything as being for itself. Through our consciousness, through our ability to recognize our existence, our position in the universe, our solitude, our isolation, our humanity, our particular humanity, we become divorced. For Camus, we do not stand in front of the absolute. There is no absolute. There is no God. Or at least there's not one that we can know. For Kierkegaard, we do stand in front of the absolute. We do stand in front of God. And this is the absurd. For Solomon, we stand in front of the absolute, and we are divorced from it. And our duty to it is meaningless. And it is there we see the threads of Kierkegaard and the threads of Camus merging in a very intricate way. That even if there is a duty to God, even if we could discover the existence of God, which would not necessarily annul Camus' theories because of the divorce that would still exist between us and God, just as the divorce exists between us and the world, it would be meaningless. It could exist, and it might very well, we cannot epistemologically verify this, but it is meaningless. there is no escaping it. Um, Not even a faith can offer an escape from the meaninglessness of the being's world. This inherent life that we live. So for Camus, we are thus presented with the choices of suicide, philosophical suicide, or revolt. Suicide is the most obvious. If this divorce exists, if we can know nothing, if nothing can become clear, then why not just end it? We know we're going to die, so why not just accelerate this process? It does not annul the absurd. It simply destroys one side of the equation, but the world continues to exist. We have the idea of philosophical suicide, which I've discussed, which Camus believes Kierkegaard hates. Then we have revolt. It's hard to say if Solomon ever actually revolts. He believes in this God, he believes in this absolute, but he understands the divorce between it and him. But he still proclaims that there is a duty to it. So in that duty, he seems to commit the same sort of philosophical suicide that Kierkegaard commits from the vantage point of Camus. But he acknowledges the divorce nonetheless. He acknowledges the meaninglessness of it nonetheless. And he does it explicitly. He says this is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. By saying everything is meaningless, he includes our relationship to God. Everything must be included when we preface everything in front of any phrase. So it becomes interesting at the very least, and this is what I examined in the paper, was this issue of the absolute, of God, of our position in the world as human particularities, as being for itself, and that we are faced with choices. None of those choices makes anything clearer, builds a divorce, the absurd remains. For both Camus and Kierkegaard, the absurd is present within the world and outside the world for Solomon. It is both metaphysical, it is both empirical. It is between you and me, it is between everything in this world that belongs to the world that is not I. For Solomon, it also belongs to me and God. This metaphysical entity that I cannot touch and that I cannot prove to exist, but that he nonetheless believes to exist and believes to. In essence, that is my argument and the essence of my paper. There's very not too much left in there. The only other thing I could really add is when naming the paper, I had confusion because I said on the phenomenology. I don't do a good job of exploring phenomenology, of intentionality, of things of this nature. I don't get much into Husserl or Heidegger. A more proper name, some might say, would be on the existential nature. But I break apart from the existential by focusing on Camus. The implementation of certain Sartrean thought does not make this an essay about existentialism, nor does it make me a proponent of existentialism in any way. There are particular elements of the Sartrean thought that were applicable. So a bit absence of true phenomenology in this paper, I do believe, is a paper of phenomenology rather than existentialism. It is a paper more than anything else of the absurd, of the phenomenon of the absurd, as presented from three different vantage points. That is the best way I could use to describe what this paper is.
We done? Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm Carl Sachs, and I'm presently visiting researcher at Georgetown University, and I'm just going to ask a few questions and comments. So I'm very interested in the notion of meaninglessness that you have going on here. And it seems a little problematic because, you know, you can think in one sense, right, the absurd is meaningless by definition.
Yes.
But at the same time, the encounter with the absurd does have, existential significance. It is, in Kierkegaardian terms, right, the telos of human existence. So even though it's meaningless in an epistemological or metaphysical sense, it still has this existential significance. So I guess I would have maybe liked to hear more clarification about these senses of meaninglessness that you have going on here. And so that would be one issue I'd like to raise. And I also am sort of interested in, the concept of the night of faith and how that is playing a role in your paper. So let me sort of ask you, by your lights, would Sisyphus himself count as a knight of faith? And would Solomon, or the author of Ecclesiastes, whoever he was, would he count as a knight of faith? And so maybe if you could explore that in terms of the contrast between the knight of faith and the knight of infinite resignation, that would, I think, clarify where you're coming from.
Yes. So the issue of meaninglessness. The aspect of meaninglessness which I address is the objective a priori, the essence, as it were. That I emerge in this world as a particular, but there is some objective a priori reason for my being here. I have some God-given duty to do something that doesn't exist. That meaning for Camus is not there. For Kierkegaard, it might very well be there. For Solomon, having the duty to God, it is certainly there. The existentialists seem to believe that through the negation of one's being, they could reaffirm the being and establish some sort of meaning in a way. That becomes subjective, and it becomes part of the particularity of the individual being for itself. I don't consider this meaning because it is not viable. I can tell you right now, the meaning of my life that I have chosen is this. And then before the end of this conversation, I could say, no, actually it's this, and it could be something very contradictory. So at the very least, there's no static meaning. And I can constantly be changing and saying, this is why I'm here, this is why I'm here, but it's always a choice. And so really all I have are my choices and my actions. And if those attribute a meaning to my life for somebody else or for me, then so be it, but there's still no objective a priori. I can say, I am here to do this. But there's no God-given reason, or at least none that I can know. I say, this is the meaning of my life. It may very well be, but I cannot know that. The meaninglessness rests upon this fact that it cannot be epistemologically verified. That we can never actually say that there is such and such a meaning. You could argue easily, the existentialist, that you can create meaning for yourself in certain ways. But that just seems very tricky for me because it's of the constant changing of the being for itself. The lack of static. That if I had a meaning in my life, it would seem that would reflect throughout the entire time I'm alive. And it wouldn't be able to change. I couldn't say in one moment the objective reason or meaning of my life is this, and then another moment say the objective meaning reason for my life is this. I can simply say I choose to do this or I choose to do that for these reasons. I don't see that as creating meaning. I just see that as choice, and I see that as the revolt, which Camus discusses. In terms of the Night of Faith, we have a content of our life, and that's kind of where we go with this. So I say, I have a dog, for example, and I like my dog, I love my dog, and I could dedicate my life to my dog, and that could be the content of my life. That I do everything for my dog, but nothing else matters. For Abraham, the content of his life is Isaac. He waited, I think it was 120 years, because their lifespans were incredibly longer. It's mythology, so that's permissible. But their lives are so much longer that he waited 120 years for a child. He finally has a child. This is the content of his life. This is what he's devoted his life to. God promised it to him 120 years earlier. And I might have the year range off, and my biblical knowledge is not but it was a very long time. The Knight of Infinite Resignation would say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice my son, Isaac, that's it. That's it. That's done. Knight of Faith is Abraham, who says, I will sacrifice my son, but I still have faith that in this lifetime I will see him again. The example of the prince or the peasant and the princess. I am in love with this princess. I can resign my love and go on, but I have hope and faith that I will move on and I will find this princess and she will marry me and we will be together. Against all odds, this is the leap of faith. It's absurd, especially in situations where the peasant and the princess could never meet, could never be wed. This is the absurd. And when it comes into being, the leap of faith is fulfilled, that is what we see, is the content of the life return. And if one would want to say, well, that's your meaning, is your content the content of the life you choose, if that's how you want to define meaning, then that's the meaning. Of course, this paper is so much based on the particular that I couldn't tell you you're wrong or right. That you could define it that way, I wouldn't. That's just my personal opinion. Is I don't see it because I see meaning as being something objective that comes into or evades the life of the individual. It is the essence. Even if existence precedes essence, if that essence were to be meaning, it would need to be lifelong. Otherwise, it's just a whole part of your life, the choice you make. And essence just becomes an action, a choice, not an actual meaning. Sisyphus is a knight of infinite resignation. So, and what Camus tells us is that what is from Greek mythology, what we know is that he left Hades with permission to see his wife, whom he loved, and he loved the world. He was a part of it. The content of his life was life itself. To live, to breathe. He was the ascetic. He was in that sphere of existence. He was the particular who didn't care to stand in front of the absolute. He loathed the absolute, and the absolute punished him. The gods punished him. So he pushes his rock up and down the hill daily for all of it. But nowhere do we see either in Camus' reinterpretation of this or in the Greek mythology that Sisyphus ever says, I have faith that I will return to the world from whence I have come, that I will return to the life as it once was. We see resignation. We see him resigning by pushing the rock up the hill. An author whose name is John Foley, who talks about the act of the absurd and revolt, the revolt which becomes more pressing in his later works. Sisyphus never takes the revolt that would allow actual solidarity with other human beings to emerge. He is the existentialist who sees the absurd as the end. He is not the absurdist who sees the absurd as the beginning. Where the absurdist sees the absurd as the beginning, the transvaluation of values becomes possible. The embracing of a new life without hope and without despair, without anxiety, anguish, these things go away, but these things are central to the existentialist doctrine. Anxiety, anguish, all the way from Heidegger to Sartre. These things are pressing, these things are important, and that's I believe that's because they view the absurd, that they don't see anything past the absurd. So they are forced into this position of resignation where anxiety, anguish, and despair appear, and they say, well, we can't have hope. They agree with Camus on that, but Camus also tells us we don't need to have despair or anxiety or anguish either. We don't need to negate our existence. We need simply to live. To revolt against the absurd, to understand it, to feel it, to be with it. We cannot escape it, but we can revolt against it every moment of our lives. For me, that's beyond Knight of Faith. Because the Knight of Faith is hope. Hope for something. There is no hope, nor is there despair. And Camus is very clear about this throughout not only the myth of Sisyphus, but even in his notebooks. Even Meursault from The Stranger, completely honest, You see one instance of outburst and anger against the religious priest who comes to visit him. He kills a man and is completely honest about it. He never takes a leap of faith. He never believes he's going to get out of the cell. He never despairs either that he's going to be executed. So he has no hope for freedom, but he neither despairs that he's going to be executed. He just lives the life that he is given.
Okay, so it sounds to me like part of what you want to do here is say something like this. Yeah, there are two different ways of acknowledging the absurd, not shrinking away from it, not backing off. Two different ways of honestly confronting the absurd. Those two different ways being the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation.
Well, I would say that neither of those actually face the absurd in the way Camus would say. But both of those are
in that case, I misunderstood. Okay.
The night of faith is philosophical suicide by holding on to hope.
Okay, but let me just ask a question here. So, I understand, of course, that that's what Camus thinks.
Yes.
About the night of faith. That's understandable. But it seems to me that there is a Kierkegaardian rejoinder, right? Where the Kierkegaardian says, well, no, the night of faith is not philosophical suicide precisely because philosophical suicide is itself part of the you might say it's like the epistemological correlate of the ethical, because it's that philosophical suicide is when we're trying to have a certain kind of universal framework in which everything makes sense and everything has an assigned location within that framework. So there's a kind of universality, and the particulate, or particular, is negated or left behind. Whereas the night of faith reclaims his particularity, and so transcends the sort of universality of philosophical suicide.
Yeah. There's actually an irony here.
Huh?
If you think about it, there's an irony, is that for Kierkegaard, the only philosophical suicide would be not choosing a content of your life. For Camus, choosing a content of your life is to hope for something, is to attribute meaning to your life in some way, which is in fact philosophically suicidal. But Camus would say the leap of faith would be philosophically suicidal, and Kierkegaard would say it's not. So we see kind of an irony developing.
Yeah, and that's the irony I'm trying to sort of tease out here. Because, and I guess I'd like to hear maybe a bit more from you about why the Kierkegaardian rejoinder is not going to persuade you. Because the Kierkegaardian rejoinder just says, well, look, the night of faith is a way of living in the absurd. The night of faith, I mean, think about, say, Abraham, there's when God says to Abraham, you're going to take your son and kill him. Actually, back up a moment. The way the story goes, God says, Abraham. And Abraham's response is, here I am. That's to say, Abraham doesn't say, yeah, what do you want? Or what's up? He positions himself in a state of total submission and acceptance without even asserting himself or without trying to locate his relationship with God within some framework. And it's that moment of here I am that marks Abraham as the knight of faith.
Mhm.
So I guess I'd like to hear a bit more about why that doesn't count. Why is that not good enough for Camus?
For one, because we can't prove that God exists. That's the simplest explanation. And,
But it seems that's missing it because, to be honest, because Kierkegaard doesn't care about that. You know, in a sense, I think Kierkegaard might even agree with Camus that in a certain way, to even ask for proof that God exists is itself philosophical suicide. And Abraham has transcended the need for that.
yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. I'd never thought of it in that framework. I think that Camus' biggest opposition to the Knight of Faith is the fact that hope is involved. Is that for him, faith and hope are kind of synonymous. When Abraham has faith that he will have the content of his life, Isaac, returned to him in this lifetime, he hopes for that. Hope for that which is not defies where we are. It is to take ourselves away from the present moment, our present existence. It defies, even in like a Levianassian way, enjoyment of life. That to constantly hope for that which is not here, to put an X on our calendars for 2 weeks from now, we miss the 14 days between now and then. Camus wants us to be grounded and present, in the moment, facing life as it comes, choosing what comes. And I wouldn't even say Camus wants that for us. I would say Camus thinks that's the only authentic way of living, is to be present in the moment.
So there's something deeply inauthentic about hope itself.
Yes, as with despair.
Ah, okay. Now, so let's go back to despair for a moment there. So, perhaps in a certain way, both the Knight of Faith, by virtue of his hope, and the Knight of Infinite Resignation, by virtue of his despair, are both in this nebulous space that Camus doesn't really identify, where they have gone beyond the need for philosophical or plain suicide. So they're sort of adjacent. They're adjacent to the absolute. They're adjacent to the absurd. But they're not all the way there yet.
I would say that for Camus, hope and despair are philosophical suicide.
Oh, okay. Huh. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Because I was thinking about philosophical suicide in terms of some sort of overarching framework of intelligibility. But
I don't think there needs to be necessarily a overreaching framework, as it were. It needs to be a reaching toward some sort of framework. To hope for like the end of a war is to reach toward the framework that defines peace. You might not know what that looks like. You might not have any intelligible way of determining this, but it is this reaching forth. The existential negation is a reaching forth for finding some sort of subjective particular essence that can be determined by being for itself at any given moment. The leap of faith is a reaching forth for that absolute, for God. It is the philosophical suicide, in the simplest way, is reaching past the present moment, past the being for itself, past the subjective particular that defines the I, who I am, in such a way that I do not die literally, but my presence as present is metaphorically slaughtered. That I stand here, but I am no longer alive. I am a corpse. wishing for them.
Okay. So, I guess. So now, if Sisyphus is the Knight of Infinite Resignation, and there's something inauthentic about that, then, in a certain way, even Sisyphus is committing philosophical suicide. You know?
Yeah, and this is interesting because David Carroll tells us in an essay that Camus in 1955 had moved past the absurd, that his focus was on revolt. And this is where John Foley tries to bridge the gap between the absurd and revolt. The Myth of Sisyphus was written in 1942. Even though Camus only lived, I think, 19, or maybe it was 21 years after that, he moved past the ideas first presented in the Myth of Sisyphus. And when you read the English introduction that he wrote to that translation, he tells us that. After writing the Rebel, he tells us that he has moved past the premises he set down in the absurd, but that the Myth of Sisyphus remains the most personal of his works, and the themes within there still reverberate. But it is like a seed. In my mind, the Myth of Sisyphus is like the seed that germinates and grows. And the difference between Camus and many other philosophers is where the seed typically grows into philosophy. Camus only writes one philosophical text after that, and a series of philosophical essays in Rebellion, Resistance, and Death. These novels, short stories, and plays. That his growth is a movement away from philosophy, toward actual lived experience, toward the creation of the self through that artistic expression. And I think that, for him, the most authentic way of living. And when you read his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, the way he discusses art, the way he discusses beauty, it reverberates throughout there. The philosophy is not the end point. Like the absurd, it's the starting point. And we're all moving towards this act of creation, which is most present in true art, in true artistic creation. That is where Camus falls. The recreation of the Myth of Sisyphus, I think, was one of his first creations, but it wasn't his own creation. It was a recreation, a reinterpretation. When he moves past this, he begins creating his own. The play. Caligula was based on Caligula, Rome, but when we see the plague, the first, the stranger. We begin to see him branching out and creating, not just recreating or interpreting. And so his journey is towards art. That he starts with the absurd, and he becomes an artist, which is a very interesting way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So it's almost the reverse of Kierkegaard's progression.
In a way, yeah. I hadn't thought of it like, but yeah.
I guess I want to ask you a bit more about Camus and politics.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yes, not to say know much about this, but it's sort of when Camus gets more political that he sort of moves closer to my own heart. So we can sort of think that part of the problem, and you sort of addressed this a little bit in your comments, is that Sisyphus is alone.
Yeah.
Sort of Sisyphus' isolation is itself a marker of not what's wrong with him, but there's something missing. And that it's the solidarity, it's our life lived with and for others that is really quite definitive of how to live authentically in a world without meaning in your stipulated sense.
Yeah, an essay I'm actually working on now is reappropriating the absurd through the eyes of Levinas, of the face-to-face.
Sure.
The divorce is not just the separation between myself and the world, it's my divorce between me and you right now, between me and everybody else in this world. between that metaphysical other that Levinas talks about, that is not outside the universe, but that is present within the universe and can only exist after that face-to-face. And I explore that through the murder of the Arab, which also has a lot of political ramifications. Why is the Arab unnamed? Why do we never know anything about him? So there's a lot of political subtleties that Camus addresses even in his early work. With the Rebel, he becomes more explicit. Very anti-communist, very anti-Marxist, very much pushed out. But like Levinas, he was a humanitarian. And that's why I see, beyond their political similarities, I see the absurd in the pages of Levinas. I see the face-to-face in the pages of Camus.
Yeah.
And I think that's where politics starts.
I think that sounds right. And certainly one nice way of doing that through Levinas is that with Levinas, you can get this idea that there is a kind of absurdity in the encounter with the face of the other, because that's not subsumable, right? It's not. It's an enigma in Levinas' sense, right? So like it's the encounter with the face of the other is the point at which phenomenology breaks down or reveals its own limits.
Yes.
Right. So then, but one thing about Levinas that I really admire and appreciate is where he says, "Oh, but then on the other side, you have to go through that. You have to go through that. But then on the other side of that, you have the problem of what he calls the third."
Yes.
And it's a very opaque notion. It's hard to know what's really going on here. But I think that there's this really deep insight that's how you get politics into the picture, or at least an authentic politics, the right kind of politics. Right. So that's where you have to, because that's when justice enters into the picture.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. And what I'm more focusing on is mostly on the face-to-face. I don't focus too much on the emergence of the third person because I appropriate it through the scene of the murder and the stranger. How the face-to-face between Meursault and the unnamed Arab, the brightness of the sun, the changing of the colors, is reflective of the absurd divorce between both Meursault and the world at that moment, but between him and the unnamed Arab at the same time. And it would be an interesting way of exploring the political aspects of otherness. Why is the Arab unnamed? What does it mean to be a stranger in a strange land? How do you become a stranger in your own homeland, which is what the Arab became in Algeria? The political ramifications are enormous.
Yeah, of course, once we're talking about Levinas and Arab, you're getting into some rather ugly comments on his part.
Yes, but we can. We don't need to get into those.
yeah, exactly. So I guess maybe we should probably wrap this up pretty soon.
Yeah. However much longer.
So let's just turn back to Ecclesiastes then.
Okay. Yeah. Let's come back to the paper.
Right. So come back to the paper. So you've already said that there's a certain way in which both the Knight of Faith and the Knight of Infinite Resignation are both committing a certain kind of philosophical suicide.
Yes.
Does the author of Ecclesiastes, does he succeed in avoiding philosophical suicide by your standards?
It's difficult to know because of his position is so strange. At the completion of Ecclesiastes, he tells us we have a duty to God. He tells us that duty is meaningless. Does he follow through on that duty? Does he stand before this absolute, or does he turn away? The book of Ecclesiastes doesn't leave any answers at its conclusion about the author himself and how he lives his life. It is a story about it is philosophy in, in, in the simplest sense of the term. It's very philosophic. Um, it depends. If he stands in front of the absolute and truly believes that God is there and has hope that there's something will come, or if he is despairing in the meaninglessness of life, which at points it seems he might be, then he has committed philosophical suicide. If he resigns himself to the fact that God is there, is not going to follow through on what God wants or on that duty, but he's going to live his own life and revolt against that, that becomes even more complicated because now he's recognized the divorce between himself and God, and one could argue that he is now revolting against the absurd through resignation rather than becoming a knight of infinite resignation in itself. So the issues posed here are numerous, and the argument based upon the deconstruction of the text could go any way. And I think that's one of the greatest things about Ecclesiastes, is at first glance it appears just as a very simple text. It's a book from the Bible, who really cares, whatever. But you look at it, there's a depth to it. And there is an interpretive, if you really read it, you have to have some sort of interpretative ability, some notion of what deconstruction is and what it means to deconstruct a text, and the ability to deconstruct it from different perspectives and to analyze both those perspectives, understanding that both of those are substantiated by the exact same passages in the text. That makes the issue of determining what the author in Ecclesiastes does difficult. Because from one perspective, you could argue he commits philosophical suicide. Using the exact same reasons, evidence, and passages, reinterpreting them differently, he does not commit philosophical suicide.
I see. So the text is undecidable at certain level.
Yeah.
I see. Very
We don't know what he does, and we are never presented with his motives after the text concludes.
Interesting. Well, I think we've been talking for about 40 minutes or so.
Yes, that seems about right.
I think so. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation very much.